question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Forrest.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on this bipartisan motion, and I rise also to condemn Hamas and its militant terrorist attacks on Israel and its ongoing barbarity. And I stand in support of Israel and the people of Jewish faith wherever they are living, whether it's in Israel, here in Australia, and around the world. Like them, we mourn for the lives lost and pray for those still missing or those who've been taken hostage. There is endless trauma, worry and despair for the family and friends of the nearly 200 babies, children and adults who are still missing or being held hostage. Make no mistake, this attack and killing of at least 1,300 people on one day was Israel's worst day since the Holocaust. And I want to express my deepest sympathy and offer sincere condolences to the people and state of Israel, the Jewish members of Parliament here in Australia, in particular my colleague, the member for Berowra, as well as the Jewish community here in Australia, many of whom have family and friends who have been or are directly affected in Israel itself. And none of us will forget where we were when we first saw and heard the horrendous attacks and saw the images as the attacks and atrocities unfolded. The footage it was horror for us all, and horror for the people in Israel. Disgustingly savage, abhorrent brutality and disgusting attack on Israeli citizens and its civilians, the civilians, by Hamas. Hamas, which is a listed, prescribed terrorist organisation. Make no mistake, they are terrorists. Many of us were thinking, just how on earth would we have felt, and what would we have done in our communities or homes initially when the 2,200 missiles started hitting? How would we feel if it was our children, our grandchildren, our family, our friends, or our own community members? The heartbreak we would feel if it was our young family members at the Nova Music Festival, among the 260 who were driven into the desert and indiscriminately gunned down. How we would be constantly reliving the terror that these young people felt as they tried to escape. How we would have felt if it was our family, friends or neighbours who were shot as they tried to flee or get to safety and were shot in their vehicles. But the extraordinary and dreadful brutality of babies being beheaded or killed in their cots. And how on earth would we live with the sheer terror of the brutality on women? Women that you know or knew or loved, naked, abused, and openly paraded through our streets. How would we feel? Well, I grieve for those who used their bodies to cover their children as the jihadists cheered and jeered, as they took hostage the elderly and kidnapping and abducting babies and children. Just the sheer heartache of that. And I will never forget the father crying in relief because his daughter was found dead and was not being held hostage and subjected to the most vile and unimaginable torture and abuse at the hands of Hamas. If this were to happen in Australia, Australians would not only be outraged, they would demand that the government respond with whatever force necessary to rescue our people and respond to any and every ongoing threat. And knowing what the expectations of Australians rightly would be, I've always been proud to be an Australian, but for the first time, I was profoundly ashamed and angry at the lack of response to the rally held at the Sydney Opera House as it happened. It's something I thought I'd never see, or that it would be condoned in Australia, where we saw the pain and suffering of the Jewish Australians compounded by a lack of action and profoundly disgusting comments coming from the group, say gas the juice, but much worse, gas the Jews. The fact that the Australian Jewish community could not safely gather to see the Opera House lit up in their country's blue and white as a sign of support and comfort was beyond belief for me as an Australian citizen and a proud Australian citizen. And I never ever thought I would see the day when Jewish people in Sydney would be told that they weren't safe at the Opera House. I was even more outraged to see that the only person who was arrested was a man carrying an Israeli flag. Again, totally un-Australian. And I want to see those offenders charged. It was an illegal protest, and the anti-Semitic hate speech. We've not seen this level of anti-Semitism in Australia ever before. And I understand how vulnerable Jewish people are feeling. Jewish children should be and should feel safe wearing their school uniforms and going to their schools. And Jewish people should feel safe in Australia. But I have been really concerned, as I heard discussed by the Shadow Minister Sarah Henderson, about anti-Semitism in our universities. The fact that 2/3 of Jewish students on Australian university campuses have experienced anti-Semitism. And the lack of action from our academics in this regard, in my view, is reprehensible. Sydney University, we saw dreadful signs which the academics and the administration ignored, took no action. This is not Australia or Australian. And I understand there were academics who attended the protests, and I find that appalling as well, given what was said and done at that protest. This is Australia. I hope the perpetrators have been identified and continue to be identified, and if they're on a visa, like the Leader of the Opposition has called for, to have their visas cancelled and deported from our country. The government needs to report these numbers to the Parliament so that we all know exactly what action has been taken. And these are just some of what's been perpetrated against the Israeli people. Deliberate acts of violence directly intended in Israel to inflict maximum harm on innocent civilians by Hamas. Now, there is global support for Israel, its right to exist and its right to self-defence. The resistance to anti-Semitism in all its forms is crucial. But I do want to just raise a quiet issue. The House knows the amount of work that I've done in the cyber and online space. I wanted just to encourage every Australian parent to take particularly great care of their children in their online activities, given that there are the most horrendous videos and what's out there to be seen really concerns me and the impact it has on young minds. So I'm encouraging every Australian parent to take a particularly careful approach with what your young people are viewing online. And all of this has been appalling both for Israelis and now Palestinians. And in Australia we've had and are one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world, which is why what happened at the Opera House was so appalling and so confronting for us. You know, this has been achieved through hard work over many decades, with broad political support and genuine goodwill and efforts by so many Australians. We see the welcoming of each new group of migrants who come to this country and the broad community celebrations at each citizenship ceremony. I'm sure every member of Parliament has that same experience. And there's Australians, new Australians, supporters, everyone is so happy and so delighted to be part of our country and chooses to become an Australian citizen. And I want them to be able to live and be safe and enjoy our country in the way that we always have. So we don't need to see any of this divide us. But when we saw the evil at the hands extended to the people in Israel at the hands of Hamas. The Palestinians now, in what they're facing as well. And we do know that Hamas is using Palestinian people as human shields. There is no value on those civilian lives.
Order. Member for Forrest, your time has expired.
Thank you, Speaker.
I thank the honourable member for Forrest.